The idea behind this project is to define what a monument is. The definition of a monument, according to Oxford Languages, is a statue, building, or other structure erected to commemorate a famous or notable person or event. But I would like to challenge this definition. In Central Park, at the entrance of West 85th Street, is a forgotten piece of history. Seneca Village was a predominantly African American community during the 19th century. The village existed between 1825 and 1857. In 1855, there were approximately 225 residents, a population that consisted of roughly 2/3 African Americans, 1/3 Irish immigrants, and a small number of Germans. There were over 50 homes in Seneca Village, plus 3 churches and a school. For African American property owners, Seneca Village provided residential stability and an investment in the future. Another incentive to owning property at the time was that it gave African Americans the right to vote. One of the few African American enclaves at the time, Seneca Village allowed residents to live away from the more built-up sections of downtown Manhattan and escape the unhealthy conditions of racism they faced there. But before a person can learn about the details of Seneca Village, one must know how this community started, by looking at the geographical history of Manhattan. Before people started moving north in Manhattan, most of them lived below what is now known as Chelsea, the Garment District, and Murray Hill. Over time, starting in the 1800s, the amount of slaves decreased in New York City, decreasing from 20,903 in 1800 to 75 in 1830. As more freed African Americans went into the workforce, attaining a job became increasingly harder, causing racial tensions to rise. This tension led to more and more violence, and Lower Manhattan became too dangerous for freed African slaves to live in. In 1825, plots of land began to go up for sale in what is currently Central Park. The first African American man to buy land was Andrew Williams. He bought 3 plots that started a new wave of people coming into the area. Freed African Americans talked amongst themselves, and some made the decision to move out of Lower Manhattan, away from the constant racism and segregation, to an area where they could be at ease and accepted. Williams started a movement of African Americans. Slowly, the surrounding plots were bought by other African American families, and churches led by African Americans were established. In a few years' time, they had made themselves a small sanctuary. This sanctuary was located between 82nd and 89th Street on the west side of Central Park. Moving to Seneca Village gave African Americans a safe place to live, but it also gave them a chance to vote. According to Article 2, Section A, African American men could only vote in New York if they owned property. And over the span of 30 years, Seneca Village grew to about 300 residents. According to the census of 1855, African Americans were primarily labor workers, domestic workers, waiters, and shoemakers. They built dozens of homes, 3 churches, and even had a school for their children. Seneca Village was already a milestone of its time for being an all-African American community in New York City. It was to become even more unique. German and Irish immigrants started to settle down in Seneca Village, making this now an integrated community. Based on church records from 1849 and 1850, the different ethnicities seem to have been getting along quite well. For instance, some of the white and African American families attended baptisms together, they were buried together in the same cemetery, and even intermarried. All of this was completely unbeknownst to the social standards of the time. But while all this progress was going on in Seneca Village, at the same time, Lower Manhattan, which the African Americans had previously left, had become to quadruple in size, and Lower Manhattan could no longer hold the amount of people it contained. Due to the surge of people, white elitists of the time feared that Manhattan would be overtaken with development and construction and lose its beauty. An article came out in the New York Times about the necessity of a park in Manhattan, claiming they needed to give lungs to the city, and this started the initial push to create Central Park. On July 21st, 1853, New York set aside 750 acres of land to create America's first landscaped public park, following the examples seen from Europe at the time, such as Kensington Park. But the proposed space of Central Park contains Seneca Village, along with thousands of other plots of land home to about 1,600 people. In order to get social acceptance of obtaining the land, newspapers like the New York Herald started to downplay those who lived in Seneca Village, saying in a morning edition on June 5, 1856, that the area would be revitalized and become a beautiful place, because currently it was Squatters' Village, not Seneca Village, and it was occupied by miserable-looking, broken-down shanties and mongrel dogs. Those who read the newspaper believed it was true, but us today know it was not. When the city decided to build Central Park, it used eminent domain to acquire the land. Eminent domain is the right of a government or its agent to expropriate private property for public use with payment of compensation. Residents were compensated for their property and had to leave by 1857. After they dispersed, all traces of the settlement were lost to history. Since the 1990s, scholars and archaeologists have been working to bring the history of Seneca Village back to light. In 2011, a group called the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History collaborated with the Central Park Conservancy to conduct an excavation at the site. They found about 200 different items from the site, which they took to analyze to understand this community. All the artifacts currently reside in New York City Landmark Preservation Commission inside the New York Archaeological Repository. The objects they found conclude that residents of Seneca Village were wealthier than people assumed. For example, some of the ironstone plates that they used in Seneca Village were identical to the ironstone plates that were being used in Greenwich Village, which at the time was a wealthy upper-class area. Also, items such as porcelain were found, which was another pricey item of the time. Also found was a comb, roasting pan, a smoking pipe, and part of a toothbrush. During this time, toothbrushes were not common and many people did not own one, especially those of the lower class and even some of the middle class. It wasn't until the 1920s that toothbrushes became a social norm. Looking back at the 1850 census, the fact that most Seneca Village residents had a high school education showed that they were not the average run-of-the-mill workers. During the 1850s, getting a high school education was about the equivalent of getting a graduate degree now. All these findings show that Seneca Village wasn't what the newspapers of the time called a shanty town. Rather, it was a middle-class working community. It showed the success of African American property owners, an even more successful experiment of integration of different ethnicities. Although all of this information was available during the time, it didn't matter. In a New York Times article, it was said the Evan inhabitants, after which whom the village is called, have been notified to remove themselves by the 1st of August. Many residents fought back by sending letters of objection of their forced removal, but it didn't matter because in 1857, all the land was seized and the community destroyed. Due to the erasure of its history, Seneca Village wasn't properly thought of as a monument. But looking back at all of the different achievements that it made in its time, it should be classified as a monument. People say some of the most beautiful places on earth created by man have the darkest of histories. Central Park, a piece of the city almost everyone has been to at least once, whether they are a resident or a tourist, can also fall into this category. This piece of land did not belong to the city, but rather a prosperous community. But due to the selfishness and what city officials thought would be best for the city, a community was removed, not just from Central Park, but almost from history.